Welcome back to Side Quests VIII, Final Fantasy VIII, episode 22. Back with me, my perennial companion, Wes Shantz, hopefully with better internet than we had in the pre-show. Good to see you.
Yes, I hope so. I'm here, whether you can hear me or not. And I hope that our internet situation is not being affected by all of the craziness that we are dealing with in game this time around, because there's a lot of strange, topsy-turvy, subversive nonsense going on, and maybe it's just seeping into the connection here. I don't know.
Maybe, yes, in the same way that you brought up last time that how Ultimecia may have given the impetus for the rebirth Sephiroth to reach not just across space, but across time. And perhaps now that's been extended to across reality and is now afflicting our internet.
Oh,
I think that definitely will fulfill Occam's razor. And I can't think of a simpler possible
definitely
solution
it.
than that one, frankly speaking. Nor, or more, but definitely not a more fun one either. Well, okay, so for this time, we're getting pretty late in the game, and from the dialogue we're receiving, it is like we've said, I think over the last two episodes, particularly, getting more and more linear. And I've been describing it with gravity analogies like Diablos. And there seems to be a gravitational force pulling us to the end, or a magnetic force pulling us to the end. And that really continues in this playthrough, though I will say you did an admirable job of doing, as the strategy guides often say, with exclamation marks, holding up and taking some time to go and enjoy the fact that you have the Ragnarok, this spaceship converted to very fast pleasure cruiser for you, transport vehicle. You can now get to all these places. You, as well as I, visited the island closest to heaven and to hell. I actually included those in a recent essay I wrote and submitted on Dante and video games.
Nice.
Interesting how close they actually are to each other. Um, and but then you also, before we get into the story itself, because it's pretty convoluted and I think particularly this moment is a moment when people could be lost in the convoluted nature of the final plan and the fight with the Ultimacia, as well as the sort of uh, screen time being given to the romance between Squall and Renoa. It's heavy. So there's a gravitational pull towards the end, as well as having these two narrative elements that are both um, well, we'll have to evaluate them, but potentially a little bit. One's a little convoluted, maybe one's a little tepid. Maybe they're both weak plot elements leading into a very quick conclusion. I'm not saying like Xenogears, and nor am I begging the question and making the evaluation prior to giving the case, but especially because this game's reception was not as warm as Final Fantasy VII One Wonders. Though
Mhm.
I'll temper that with something I haven't said this entire time, which is, of course, Final Fantasy IX had lower sales numbers than 8 too, though it was competing against Final Fantasy X, which was on the PS2, which was
Mhm.
being released um, very, very, very soon after that, maybe even contemporaneously. And Square has itself admitted that that was a marketing mistake. So those numbers may belie how much people actually loved the games.
Interesting problem to have. The the way that this section, yeah, on the one hand opens up, you can go anywhere in the Ragnarok, but on the other hand, once you start doing certain things, those options will close off again. Uh, is dangerous. Yeah, this is where you see those exclamation points pop up. And even if you do start doing the things you're supposed to do plot-wise, I feel like the game is purposely making those more complicated than they need to be. And maybe that's something it's been doing all along with some of the ways that missions are getting explained to Squall. He, of course, is always sort of uninterested in any larger implications. He just wants to know what he needs to do, and then he goes and does it. Um, in this case, the player literally has this option of like, you know, do I go where they're telling me to go and do the thing that they're telling me to do, or do I just want to do my own thing? And if you go too far down the path of listening to what other people are telling you, you definitely do miss out on some crucial opportunities to prepare yourself in a real way for the end of this game. And that specifically has to do with some hidden GFs, but also locations like the islands of Hell and Heaven and the Cactuar desert island, which is quite an important place. But also the Odin ruin area, which involves finding a couple of pseudo GFs slash GFs. Yeah, I think those are the main things. You're also able to refine any remaining cards and items and things at this point, and really start to max out some of the attributes that you might want for your final kind of setup of your party. But yeah, like in terms of the plot here, we've got Renoa to rescue, and then there's a little episode at the House of Idea, and then from there you're summoned to rescue the president of Vestar. I don't know if you did that mission yet, but yeah, okay. So then we finally find out who the president of Vestar is, and get our final marching orders against Ultimecia from him. So yeah, my impression was that the way that that final mission is explained really kind of encapsulates this whole problem, because you have like 4 options, and the top option is tell me about the mission, right, to defeat Ultimecia. And if you choose that, it goes into this long thing, which at the end of it, you get the opportunity one more time to ask any remaining questions. But if you say no, they're just gone. You just never see any of that stuff. But there's some really important things there, like what happened to Rain. Um, I'm blanking on the other things, but
President. Where's Alone?
Elone, yes, that's the thing.
Let me out of
Because
this
she's still, yeah.
room.
And yeah, so kind of important stuff. And how Laguna became president itself is this long process of like flashbacks, some FMV sequences, cutscenes, which is easily missable. So it's a really interesting choice on the developer's part. Clearly intentional.
Yeah. Well, so I really want to get into that. I want to talk about how convoluted the final plan is, as well as what Laguna mentions, which you can miss, but which he reiterates a couple times, depending on options. But he says multiple times the greatest regret of his life is not going back to Rain, because A, she dies, and B, Elena is sent to an orphanage that she's then sent away from because she's special, and then has to live on a ship for 10 years. And she says she was happy, but how could she have been? Laguna asks in his head. And he says he has his reasons, and he's obviously very active in the administration of this government, but one wonders if that's not itself just its own sort of excuse, like the father who says he works a lot to provide for the family, but he really works a lot to stay away from the family. It's just it's a useful cover, whether he couldn't accept that ultimate responsibility. He had excellent reasons for sending Elena away from Estar after she had been kidnapped the second time. And so there's all this duplication going on. So we talked about doubles and doubling last time. But so, just like Adele is coming back, and just like Idea received her powers 2 times, and just like there are 2 sorceresses right now, we're getting interesting, perhaps intentional juxtaposition setting us up for a time compression. But okay, that's going into my second point, which is, so A, you can miss Laguna admitting his greatest regret, which he admits to Squall after Squall a couple times, says that he does not like Laguna. He didn't like how he comported himself as a soldier, and he thought his attitude needed an adjustment. And he's very forthright about saying that to his father. And while not having put together the pieces to realize this is his father, or, interestingly, if he has, perhaps, that would be all the more reason for him to act this way towards him. But my next point was, this is my understanding of what the plan is, Wes. Okay. So this is coming from Laguna's mouth. And like you said, he's perhaps the most verbose, but not necessarily the most coherent and to the point figure. Perhaps one of the more quixotic figures. And, one of his responses to Squall And when Squall asks him a direct question, he's like, "Don't you know who?" He said he doesn't say, "Don't you know who I am?" He's like, "Don't you know how I've spent my life?" Like Squall was basically asking him a question about like why he did X, Y, or Z, and Laguna's like, "Don't you get it? Like I'm bouncing around. That's the kind of guy I am." In that respect, he actually reminds me a lot of Jet, from Final Fantasy X.
Interesting.
The father who can never quite take responsibility, extraordinarily gifted to everybody around him, but not necessarily to the people who need him most. And and so this plan, Ultimecia is a sorceress from the future. In the future, and we're learning this from Dr. Odin, who
Yep.
you and I very much appreciate that he gives him a bunch of shit. He's like, oh yeah, don't worry, he won't take responsibility for anything he does. And even in his story about him, he's like, he doesn't care enough about people. He's a little too more he has stronger language than I'm using right now. He says that Dr. Odin cares more about his research than about people, and that's why he wants to find LNA. But he says that sort of thing to Dr. Odin so much that Dr. Odin says, you want to go outside and fight, and it's like, Laguna is a former Galbadian soldier who still looks like he's a Galbadian soldier, except for in flip-flops now, like the mayor of FH.
Yeah.
But okay, so we get this explanation, and so now it's not actually from Laguna, like I said, but from Dr. Odin. So he says that since he had a chance to study LNA for a small amount of time, he created a machine called Junction Machine LNA, which has the algorithm, which he's mechanized, of her ability to send herself into the past. I'm forgetting the term connection. That's what she calls it. In the future, apparently, he has further developed this machine so much that it comes to be of use to Ultimecia. And that is the machine she is currently using to embody first Idea, then Renoa, and ostensibly Adele. That comes later in the plan. The plan is twofold. The execution is that Adele, as she is being awakened, is to be killed, so that Ultimecia, using the machine Dr. Odin has made based on LNA's power, will only have one sorceress's mind that she can occupy. And if they fail to do this with Adele, either Ultimecia will use Adele to achieve her ultimate purposes, and they'll be like cut out of the equation and have no recourse, or Adele's consciousness will, this sort of like a Final Fantasy VII Genova Sephiroth trope, will overcome Ultimecia's, and then she'll just be an even more horrifying and absolutist ruler than she was. And so Adele needs to die, and that's just a cold hard fact. Then,
Yeah, what they say is, I want to throw this in here. This is very Final Fantasy VII, right? Adele's consciousness could win over Ultimecia, and
yes,
then she will access all of Ultimecia's power and will definitely destroy us. We can't possibly win against their combined power. So yeah, so defeat Adele before Ultimecia can reach her, before she can fully awaken. Then there's only one, right? There's only Renoa, right?
and there's only Renoa. When she gets, so then she'll, Ultimecia, using her device, will take possession of Renoa.
Okay.
Renoa, with Ultimecia's consciousness, with the help of this device, will then have all of these consciousnesses, hers and Ultimecia's, sent by Elone into a deeper pass, where then Ultimecia will instigate time compression. Once she instigates time compression, there will be ripples in reality that are recognized by Dr. Odin, and Elene will summon Renoa back to their time and Ultimecia back to the future. Ultimecia will then continue time compression, or time compression will continue on, and that process will be used by the Squall and company in the present to then access the future, where they can kill Ultimecia, because they have to kill her in the future because her body she is located in the future. When she astrally projects into the past, it's only her consciousness, and it's not like the Matrix, where if her consciousness dies, she dies. Those aren't the rules of this cosmos.
Odin.
As we're, told it's an interesting process by which, both Odin dictates reality, but also tells us the fundamental underlying causality of it. He's sort of like God speaking it into existence, right? Because we just have to accept his version, even though
Yeah,
there's some seeming holes in it with this double throwback and this time compression, and all of a sudden it doesn't matter necessarily who you're with. And I
yeah.
also want to add in that today I already gave away the ending, saying that 13 years ago she
Hmm.
received and this was a question. So multiple of my
Right.
questions are being resolved about the succession of Hein and
Gotcha, gotcha.
the sorcerers there can be, right? Like she did receive sorcerer's powers when she was 5, but then also 13 years ago. So 4 years
Hmm.
after Squall was born and 5 years after the Sorceress War. And so we will see that moment actually in the ending FMV. And so
Cool.
it's interesting that she says, well, you kind of ruined my life, Squall, but you need to achieve this and you're going to have to ruin people's lives. And she's like, I actually accept that. And it's she and Sid are sorts of sad figures, though ultimately I would think they're sort of triumphant figures. Um, um, yes, in any case, that is what I take to be the plan. And let me put a pin in two comments I would like to make. I'd like to make a comment on Adele's dress because I think there was something revealed in that, and also your comment on child soldiers from last time. So if
Hmm.
we don't get to those, that's okay, but I would like to get to those. But that is how I saw how the plan was described. And,
Yes.
and yeah, so
That makes sense. My sense of the statement from Idea about meeting another sorceress there, I had not pieced that together, but that's really helpful to say, okay, that's the moment when this plan is coming about because they leave it sort of open, like Elone could choose to place Ultimecia in Adele. That would obviously be very bad. And I don't know, but I think that Adele is locked away by then, right? So that would be out in space. So that would be unhelpful. Um, but if that leaves Idea as the only option, then yeah, that explains Idea's uh, kind of. She just sort of blurts this out as Squall is leaving, um, and it is unclear to me why or whether this all has to do with how Odin understood the like the ease with which he was going to deal with Idea's sorceress powers. Um, this like exorcism that he talked about. Um, Again, like I feel like there's some sort of time loop situation that's already established here. If that's the case, if she has that memory, then this is all in a way like fated in a very strict sense. If we're not doing some sort of multiple worlds situation with the time jumping thing, if we're sort of within a timeline and it involves looping back and forth, uh, then everything has already happened, right? All that the story is able to do is un untangle it for us in a kind of sequential process of our experience of it. And it's suddenly very like whatever Elone does with sending people back, to fully understand what's already happened and can't be changed. Um, Now, there's some other problems here, I think. Um, the dress is one of them, because this is something that definitely keeps coming up. Um, like if you talk to Kiros, um, he'll you'll have his comment on clothes again, and this is something that you talk about with other people in S-Star too. Like they're really interested in fashion, and I do feel like that's a really crucial part of this game. It's so evocative, it's so emphasized both in the text and in the visuals, um, that I can't help but think you know they're trying to do something with um, like symbolic imagery through the characters' get-ups. And uh, I don't know if that's because they realized there's like this huge market with cosplay and they went that route with it, or if they were just using this, better and better visuals to like through the medium tell the story in this kind of fashion forward process. Either way, it is super interesting. Um, I also wanted to mention like in the little sequence with Renoa that we get before this, which I think is requisite to get to the Laguna part. I think you have to go back to the house do the thing with Idea as you're leaving. But before that, you find this other section of Idea's house, which is kind of hidden, like you would never see it otherwise. But the dog leads you there, or somehow you get pointed there, and it's the
Angela,
field. Yeah, Angela the dog, right? And it's the field of flowers that you'll recall from the opening cutscene at the start of the game.
you make
And
that promise.
they have this
I'll
conversation about, yeah, the promise of like I'll be here. And so this is another piece of the plan that gets kind of elaborated later once Laguna's on the ship with you, right? Like, okay,
yes.
but once we're lost in time compression world after Ultimecia, the source of it is destroyed, how do we find our way back? Like, what then? And this is very Final Fantasy X as well, right? Or 7 for that matter. Like, you're defeating this ultimate being, which has twisted reality in such a way that maybe doing so is self-sacrificial. We don't know if we're going to make it back, but they seem to think that very, uh, you know, cliche as it is, right? Very corny, I think Skull said, right? It's the love for one another, it's the friendship, it's the trust in one another that will lead us back. And if you have like a clear memory in your mind of a place that you can get to, you surely will arrive there. And so again, this idea of like the consciousness and the body somehow being, uh, you know, able to be interchangeable, right? In some sense, um, which I find really interesting. It's also like this has already happened, right? Because we saw it at the start of the game. All of this is sort of just playing out for us. Um, and yeah, I guess the only question is whether we have the means to see it through. Uh, I guess love is as good a word for that as anything. But as we were saying the other day, right, there's different ways that might look. So love of the story, love of the characters, and then maybe love of fully exploring and maximizing and getting all kind of into the nitty gritty of buffing your characters for the final battle. So it's kind of, yeah, odd mechanics versus story
Yes. So
problem.
I agree. That's no, yeah, the ludic versus the narratological there, and I think that's true. That the again something that may have lost players besides the mechanics of the game becoming especially important here because one one's choices are going to have a huge effect on how successful one is in the end
Mm,
game portions. One doesn't want to be over leveled. One needs certain GFs. One needs to have certain magics. Have spent certain time drawing magics. For example, the game is very rewards you quite a bit for visiting the Isle of Heaven and the Isle of Hell with quote unquote in-game magic spread along the borders of both.
right, draw points that are hidden, but if you walk around mashing X, you'll find them and yeah, start drawing
Light,
really strong magic.
Ripple, Aura, Holy, Meteor, Flare, all extraordinary magic that not only is powerful to be cast, but is extraordinary to be junctioned
Hmm.
on. Like, I think I have like 60 meteors on Quistis's HP, and it jumped from something like 1700 to 3700.
Yep.
And it's this magic is essential for the end game. So we're relying on like love and this corny notion of getting through this extremely difficult part of the game. The Renoa Squall bit is still pretty truculent and childish seeming, even though Squall is sort of opening up to her. He's still sort of insisting on being in her presence, and then saying that they're going to meet in this field, which had this extremely prominent place in this stylized opening where we which we all have burned into our memories
Now
because
hold
of
on. Do you think do you think that's Squall's dream? Because Renoa talks about a dream that she just had, right? And it would be the opportunity for Squall to say, I've had this dream. This is why I know that we'll make it back. I've seen this in my dream. But he says the opposite. He says, oh, your dream was just a dream, right? Don't worry about it. So it's very interesting to me to think about whether or not he saw what we saw in that opening sequence, right? Is that Elone connecting him in some way? Because she's also there, Does she also know that this is all sort of faded at this point? I'm because Odin seems to know everything. Ultimecia seems to know she's pretty in trouble and is trying everything to avoid it. Elone clearly has a fuller understanding of her powers by now, having gone through kind of what she did with Squall. But I'm really curious, yeah, whether Squall actually saw that dream, because his dismissal of Renoa's would read really different depending on whether he does or doesn't have that in mind. And maybe just being around GFs too long, he's forgotten all that anyway. I don't know.
Right. He does say it's interesting because what he says he forgot actually leads to him repeating something that we then remember from the beginning.
Mm,
Because what she mentions, I don't think has any bearing actually on something we would remember. And that's sort of interesting. But the dream. So you mentioned a dream. So Renoa tells Squall that she had a dream where she was running around Trabia, Galbadia, Balam, looking for him everywhere, and she wanted to see him so badly, and she couldn't find him. She couldn't find him. And then he says, right, like you said, and this is especially wrong in a video game or a narrative, right? It's
it's
just
just
a
a
dream.
dream.
It's this Chekhov shotgun or whatever, right? Like this detail is included for a reason because things aren't simply happening; they're being coded into existence. Um, and so you're right. I mean, maybe in the future with video games that have like some sort of exploratory AI or creative AI as a part of them, that will happen, but not in this game, like you said. And that's something I want to mention too. That so her dream, she wants to find Squall. He says, just write it off. But then he very matter of factly says, well, that's because we
Oh,
hadn't made the promise yet.
that's right. Okay.
And so I promise you that I'll be here. And this is interesting because this is prior, as you said, to them talking to Laguna and him saying that they need to have a spot in mind. And so
Interesting.
one
Yeah.
almost wonders whether it's bad editing or right. But so shifting gears just a little bit about what you said about accepting the sort of fate accompli of the game, like the decisions are now made, the path is laid out for you, you have only to walk it, like you said. Like, and seems to be the player and Squall having to accept, even though there's this notion of circularity and a cyclical notion in this game, that at some point there is a point of no return in one's life and in any journey, and that is something that one who wants to have a full quest or journey has to accept. And even if there is a sort of eternal return, as there may be in this a sort of eternally cycling universe, which is very interesting that the universe cycles only through this quest over and over again. And LNA is there at the beginning and really ostensibly there at the end, though she's with Laguna. Um, uh, the notion is still, even with an eternal return, there's still a single circle that is being circumscribed over and over. There's still a beginning and an end that infinitely occurs. And so, will Squall, you know, will we, instead of like in Final Fantasy VII, will we finally go to the Northern Crater, or are we going to flit away all of our time in the Golden Saucer? I did spend a lot of time there trying to get golden chocobos.
Right.
But
Right.
will he accept this constraint on his will? And will we accept this constraint on our will, having explored a game that is so much about gaining freedom? It seems like we get this sort of like Shinto um samurai sort of notion at the end, which is that, well, the ultimate thing to do is not to achieve agency, but to give it up in a way of your own choosing, because you don't get to keep it. And so you might as well give it up in this ultimate, beautiful, final, noble act, because you're going to die anyway.
So Renoa has a kind of death wish that's expressed here as well, right? Like, if the sorceress takes control of me, I want it
Mhm.
to be Squall's sword that pierces my heart, right? So it's very Freudian, very, uh, death urge heavy there. But again, he says, no, I would never do that. I'll just defeat the sorceress. It's cool, like cut through that whole Gordian knot. Um, it's totally unclear if this plan is going to work, but of course we know it has to. Like, it definitely does. Um, yeah, and so I think for that reason we're bound to accept it with all of the philosophical baggage that it implies. We'd try to, yeah, parse out, so how is this really working? I think that's where it gets tricky, because I think it comes down to the character's self-understanding, and that's by no means clear. they're so tacit about so much. Yeah, does Squall even realize that Laguna's his father? I mean, Kiros basically says it to him, right? Like, oh, it's good you take after Rain and not him. You're very, very handsome when you're in the Ragnarok. And Laguna does his like leg thing. I think right after he gives his long speech about love, his
Yes,
thing that we last saw him do way back, yeah, um, with
Julie.
Julia, and so that song, right, that blasted while they were having their moment, was that happening in the game? Like, was that playing because it's a 17-year-old ship and it's a 17-year-old song, and somehow when it booted up, like that's the song that was playing? Like, I like to think about that as something they're actually hearing, but they don't make any allusion to it, so I don't think there's really any evidence for that.
Mm.
And I don't know, yeah, because Squall doesn't say, because no one clarifies really. The internal is so minimal that we get here. We get his parentheticals every so often, but there's so little to it. It's left very much open to player interpretation how we want to read that, um, which is
Yeah,
cool.
in some ways, you make me think that he is sort of like an avatar, or like a silent protagonist, like a Chrono or a
Mm,
Link in that way, and
almost, yeah.
that he's not made to be exactly, because you can go around talking to NPCs and learn a lot more about the world and him, but you can have a much more limited experience of the game and of his personality if you take certain
Yeah,
speaking options.
you
And
just go straight for the mission and you're done, and say, no further questions.
yes, you
Whatever.
be like him. And if you are more like him, you don't learn about the nature of the world.
Hmm.
And so the game, I think, in a lot of ways dissuades you from being like him, and in that way enables you to play him in such a way that he effectively transforms from being like that, because you are forced to explore with him, and thus he has now explored the island closest to hell and to heaven. But you also have done more than I did. I did the thing that, speaking of exclamation marks, that strategy guides say don't to do.
Oh, yeah.
Don't do. Don't actually get Odin now, because it's annoying, because certain battles you'll want to fight, and he'll just show up and kill the enemy, and you won't be able
Yep.
to turn them into a card or whatever it was, or draw from them, or whatever it was you
Uh-huh.
wanted to do.
Uh-huh.
It gets turned into nearly useless Gilgamesh at the end of disc 3. So if you want, really, you should get him on disc 4, is what they
Hmm.
were saying, after the big battle with Cypher that's coming up. The
Oh, but then you
big
would
battle.
miss the activity of him defeating a GF, which I think is pretty interesting, right? Like, yeah, that's
Yes.
crazy. So again, the story is actively fighting against the optimal mechanic there, and the two don't play nice together. Yeah, I haven't gotten Odin yet. I was considering doing so that I could see that cutscene with Cypher defeating him, and then Gilgamesh coming around. I have the Gilgamesh card, which is pretty good too. But I would like to get the Gilgamesh GF. And I haven't used the Phoenix one yet either. They're both kind of these like pseudo GFs. But I have the means of summoning Phoenix. And then I do have Tonberry, Cactuar, and Doomtrain, which take quite some doing to get around to. Um, I actually probably need to run. I'm really sorry, but we can just pick up here maybe. And there's a couple of things that we had left the pin in earlier. We can circle back to those, maybe at the start of next time, um, and yeah, talk about end game prep a little bit. Aside from that, I was just gonna, yeah, keep trying to complete some side quests for a little while here. Queen of Cards is a big one, and not progress too much further. I don't know if that works for you.
Oh no.
Okay.
Well, every playthrough isn't as long as the other ones, and so I enjoyed it. And thank you for meeting at this different time from usual.
Yeah.
And I'll see you soon.
Okay. Take care.